The Germans were never denazified. To create the Bundeswehr, they had to resurrect the Wehrmacht, inclusive of German generals who were guilty of horrific war crimes. We know this to be the case. It's not even debatable. We know that many of the German generals who were appointed into NATO positions were convicted of war crimes, and they should have been put to death or imprisoned for life. I like Russia. I've been to Russia many times. I worked in the Soviet Union back in the 1980s and early 1990s. I have appreciation for Russian history, Russian culture. I'm an imperfect speaker of the Russian language. But it's not that you have to, the concept of having good relations with Russia doesn't require a giant leap. It's actually one of the most natural things one can imagine once you get to know the Russians. The problem is that because Russia has been painted as an ideological enemy, an economic enemy of the West, and now a geopolitical opponent or adversary of the West. It's the same principle. During World War II, in order to fight the Japanese, we had to fight the Japs, the Nips, and you had to dehumanize them. We called them monkeys, so we could kill them. And it's the same thing when you fight the Germans; they become the Hun. They're no longer humans. They're something different. You give them a name that dehumanizes them so you can kill them, so you can confront them without being infected with basic principles of humanity, where if you see somebody needing help, you reach out your hand to help, regardless of what color they are, regardless of what language they speak. No, when you go to war, when you have an adversary that you're willing to confront militarily, you have to dehumanize them. The Russians are not hard to get along with. You just have to treat them with respect and be respectful of who they are and what they are. They're not seeking to dominate anybody. But we're not allowed to tell that truth. We have to posture the Russians as some sort of great evil, because how do we justify the existence of NATO? I mean, Dwight D. Eisenhower, when NATO was formed in 1951, he said, if American troops are still in Europe in 10 years' time, then this exercise has failed. That exercise being NATO. And yet here we are 80 years later. NATO's a failed. There's no reason for NATO to exist. It was created on, a artificial exaggeration of a Soviet threat that didn't exist, a misunderstanding. George Kennan's long telegram, which he wrote in February of 1946, which was used by the Truman administration to create the Truman Doctrine, one of containment in confronting the Soviet Union ideologically and economically, transitioning into military containment through NSC 68, passed in 1950. Kennan later, reflecting back, said it was a mistake, that they misunderstood what he wrote. So the Cold War was a mistake. A mistake for what reason? Well, let's go back to the root cause of long telegram. Kennan wasn't asked to write a reflection on the nature of the Soviet threat to Western society. He was asked a simple question by the Department of Treasury. Why aren't the Russians buying into the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank? Why are the Russians rejecting a Marshall Plan type of, effort that they can help them rebuild? And the answer was because the Soviet Union didn't want to subordinate its economy to the West. Simple. They wanted economic sovereignty. Well, we couldn't allow them to have that. And so the whole Cold War was premised on a lie. And then what we did is we used the Cold War to shape a European reality, NATO. I mean, come on, people have to think hard here. Go back and study your history. You know that Germany was a Nazi state that we defeated during the Second World War. Most people, I think, today tend to forget that when they listen to Merz talk about the remilitarization of German society. Normally, that should elicit, horrific revulsion on anybody who knows the history of Germany. They would say never again. But no, they're like, no, that's a good thing because of Russia. And again, the idea that Germany is going to remilitarize to confront Russia means you are absolutely ignorant of history. But the point is, the Germans were never denazified. To create the Bundeswehr, they had to resurrect the Wehrmacht, inclusive of German generals who were guilty of horrific war crimes. We know this to be the case. It's not even debatable. We know that many of the German generals who were appointed into NATO positions were convicted of war crimes, and they should have been put to death or imprisoned for life. But I think it was McCloy, the American commissar that came in and took over. He pretty much oversaw the pardoning of them all, the whitewashing of them all. Eisenhower set up a board of American generals who worked with German generals to publish their memoirs in a way that purged them of any responsibility for the crimes of the Second World War, instead focusing on the pure military art of what they did. That is whitewashing. The industrialists who used slave labor were allowed to not only stay in position, but to thrive economically. And many of the Nazis who had skill sets that we wanted, we brought to the United States and cleansed. So Germany never denazified. They just simply put on a different suit. They took off the swastika, put on the pinstripes, and then sat there and pretended to behave. But deep down inside, the Germans still have the same ambitions, and we see the ambitions playing out today. The concept of Germany as a European power, the concept of Germany as being the dominant European power, the concept of Germany being the dominant military power. There's a direct connectivity between what many Germans now, and you see it's horrible what you see on social media, where people are starting now to come out and say, America fought on the wrong side. We fought on the side of the Bolsheviks. We should have fought on the side of the Germans because the real enemy is the Jew. Wait a minute, guys. Are we having this conversation? And the answer is yes, we are having this conversation. There are people out there having this conversation, and they're growing in numbers. So, no, Germany was never effectively denazified. NATO was always an artificial construct pushed on the United States, to be honest, by Winston Churchill, and the need to sustain British Empire by creating an enemy worthy of empire. And the United States bought into it. But remember that what was it? Lord, I can't remember his name. The first Secretary General of the United Nations, a British officer, Hastings, Lord Hastings. What is the purpose of NATO? To keep the Americans in, to keep the Russians out, and to keep the Germans down. Wow, really? That's what NATO was about? And the answer is that's what it was about. But then at the end of the Cold War, why did NATO continue? Why did we? Because it became more than just this artificial artifact, the artifice to shape Europe. It became a center of political and economic power, from which the European Union arose, by the way. And in order to sustain it, you need an enemy. And the enemy was the Soviet Union. But we had to keep it as Russia. But in the decade of the 90s, after the Soviet Union collapsed, we collectively put our foot on the Russian neck, and we demanded that Russia be subordinate. We tried to destroy Russia, to break Russia apart. Again, study your Russian history. Go to Russia and talk to the Russians about the decade of the 1990s. It's a horrific time. Millions of Russians lost their lives. Millions of Russians lost their lives. Millions of Russians lost their lives. The life expectancy plummeted. Suicide was outrageous. The pensioners, the people who won the Second World War, who defeated Nazi Germany, fell prey to predatory criminal aspects of Russian society that emerged in the lawlessness that existed in the decade of 1990s. Russians were taught to hate Russia. Russians were taught to revere the West. Russians were taught to turn their back on their culture, on their history, on their values. And this was good for the West. This is what we wanted from the Russians. Then Vladimir Putin came into power and said, that's not the way it's going to work. And he taught Russians to fall in love with Russia again, to respect themselves, to stand up, not to dominate the world, but to stand as equals among the world. And those in the West who previously had their foot on the neck of Russia resented this. And so we've been looking to destroy Russia and get rid of Vladimir Putin ever since. Donald Trump believes in that. Again, you just have to listen. You have to look at the reality. He's a businessman. So businessmen not only say things, but they do things to back up what they want to do. If you have a business plan of action, you'll put building blocks in place that lead you in that direction. He claims to want to be friends with Russia, but what has he ever done to be friends with Russia? Name one thing he's done to be friends with Russia. His first term ended with him saying, I have been harder on Russia than any other president. This is a man who said he wants to be friends with Russia. I've been harder on them. During his first term, he allowed the CIA to build 20 bases inside Russia, inside Ukraine, that were focused on bringing Russia down. That's not a friend of Russia. Today, he has a Secretary of Treasury who says his sole goal with Russia is to collapse the Russian economy. That's not a friend with Russia. He tried to kill the Russian president on December 29th by having the CIA work with Ukraine to send 91 drones against the Russian president residency in Valdai. That's not friends. So no, this president is 100% committed to fulfilling the same policy objectives of his predecessors, to strategically defeat Russia, to collapse Russia, and to get rid of Vladimir Putin.